BBC 4 brings to the screen The Haunted Airman.
You know that feeling I get? Someone is watching me. Well, I feel like that all the time here.
You'll have to stay here and trust me.
I've seen grim things that come and go on the borders of the night.
I will continue to treat your malady in the way I think best.
The Haunted Airman, a Halloween special, over on BBC 4 now.
How am I going to get out of here?
Got kicked out of there when I was 14.
Dad weren't really around.
This theatre project gives young people the chance to rewrite their futures. But first, they have to make it to the opening night.
It's nearly time to curtain up, and one cast member still hasn't arrived.
Imagine, a play for today, tonight at 10:35 on BBC One.
First on BBC One, the 10 o'clock news with Hugh Edwards and Louisa Preston.
Tony Blair fights off a Commons defeat on Iraq after the first big debate for over 2 years. On the day 15 people were killed in a bomb attack on a wedding party in Baghdad, some MPs demanded an investigation into what's gone wrong.
This is a chance for parliamentary accountability across the parties in a genuine cross-party motion. This is an opportunity for the House of Commons to live up to its constituents.
It will undoubtedly be interpreted as a signal which is a weakening of our commitment.
But there was confusion this evening when the Defence Secretary Des Brown said that there would be an inquiry after all. Also tonight, North Korea says it is now prepared to hold further talks about its nuclear programme. P.W. Berta, the staunch defender of South African apartheid, has died. And 7 years after Ladbroke Grove, Network Rail is facing unlimited fines after admitting mistakes.
In BBC London News, the man jailed on terror charges overseas is employed by London Underground and stepping up the hunt for the thousands of children that go missing each year.
Good evening. Tony Blair has fought off an attempt to force an inquiry into the war in Iraq. After the first formal Commons debate on Iraq for over 2 years, MPs voted by a majority of 25 against an investigation. But there was confusion after the vote when the Defence Secretary Des Brown said that there would be an inquiry after all when the time was right. Our political editor Nick Robinson reports.
It wasn't meant to be like this. These Iraqis were meant to be celebrating a wedding today. Instead, they mourned another massacre of the innocents. A suicide car bomber drove into a crowd outside a bride's home, killing 11, including 4 children. Whilst they mourned in Baghdad, they waited and watched at Westminster. Those who were always anti-war united tonight with those who backed it to try to force government to set up an inquiry.
The ayes to the right were 273. The noes to the left were 298.
Another small majority after another rebellion, but it wasn't enough for them. It followed a debate in the Commons not on the war itself, but on whether it was time to examine what had gone right and what wrong.
It's about the monumental catastrophe of the Iraq War, the worst foreign policy disaster certainly since Suez, possibly since Munich, and it's about the morass in which we regrettably still find ourselves.
An inquiry would, ministers replied, send the wrong message to our troops in Iraq and to their enemies.
It's perfectly sensible and legitimate to say that there will come a time when these issues will be explored in the round and in full so that we can learn whatever lessons we can from them. But my questions are rather, why this specific inquiry, and much more to the point, why now?
Was she hinting that one day, maybe, she'd grant an inquiry?
So the Foreign Secretary can give a firm commitment to this House that an inquiry will be held as soon as our troops leave.
What I'm saying to the House, and what I shall say repeatedly, is that this is not the time for making these decisions.
MPs should remember, she said, that they would be listening on the streets of Baghdad.
People whose bravery and fortitude is humbling and who still need our support not the rehashing of issues that have been gone over umpteen times in this House.
The Tories called for a wider inquiry, not now, but beginning in the next year, even though they once were amongst the war's loudest supporters.
But it would be utterly naive for those of us who supported the invasion of Iraq not to acknowledge that other things have gone wrong or fallen below expectations, and that unless the British people can see that those matters have been examined minutely, properly and thoroughly with a view to informing the future decisions of all of us, then the strength and unity of this country in facing future international crises will be undermined.
William Hague and the Tories and anti-war protesters make a curious coalition. But after tonight's vote, they all believe that one day ministers would concede an inquiry. And then a tired Defence Secretary appeared to promise it to them.
Margaret Beckett, when she opened this debate for the government, indicated that there would be a time for that sort of retrospective inquiry, but it's not now, and when the time is right, of course there will be such an inquiry.
It's a descent into farce, isn't it? In a way, I don't understand how the Defence Secretary can say what the Foreign Secretary was pressed to say on several occasions and just couldn't bring herself to say it.
The answer is he wasn't meant to say it, he didn't mean to say it. But Westminster knows tonight that he just did.
Well, let's talk to Nick. As you say, Nick, he did, and he said it very explicitly. So why did he say it?
Well, it was, I'm told, simply a slip of the tongue. But you have to always ask yourself, why do people slip up, Hugh? And the reason, I think, is clear. The wording of what ministers have said about an inquiry was hammered out, I'm told, after many hours, trying to find a form of wording that didn't look like they were saying no to any inquiry, didn't look like they were saying never, but didn't, on the other hand, actually promise one. So they came up with this formula that there might be a time in the future when it might be appropriate to consider whether actually to set up an inquiry. Well, I had difficulty with that formulation. The Defence Secretary clearly couldn't remember it, so he blurted out that, in fact, there will be an inquiry in the future. Precisely the form of words the Tories said would have been enough for them to actually vote with the government.
And after this day of debate, Nick, very long, lively debate, has it changed anything fundamentally?
Well, I think we are now closer to an inquiry than we were before. Let's be clear, there's genuine anxiety here from people who supported the war and are now worried about what has gone wrong. Anger from those who opposed the war, but there is, of course, raw politics too. The Tories saw an opportunity to embarrass the government, to put them on the back foot, hence this curious coalition with the Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats who'd always opposed the war while the Tories had supported it. But there is, of course, raw politics on the government side too, worried about making a promise of yet another inquiry in time that could be very, very difficult for them when there's a new leader of the Labour Party, a new Prime Minister and heading for an election. The politics is what we saw today. The inquiry, there's no promise, Hugh. I can't help feeling we'll see one day.
Nick, thank you very much. North Korea has agreed to return to talks on ending its nuclear weapons programme 3 weeks after it tested a nuclear device. The announcement came after Chinese, American and North Korean officials met in Beijing. It's thought the deal involves America reconsidering the economic sanctions it imposed a year ago. Let's join Matt Fry now in Washington.
Hugh, the crisis over North Korea has always been serious, but ever since they tested that device on the 9th of October, it has become acute, with the real potential to destabilize the rest of East Asia. So there is widespread relief tonight that the green shoots of diplomacy, however small, have reappeared. But don't hold your breath.
A country that marches like this is probably a country obsessed with preserving face. And after its recent test, it is also now a nuclear power, albeit in its infant stages. So for North Korea's dear leader to agree to talks and to do so without any preconditions is big news. And yet Washington's Special Envoy Christopher Hill looked bedraggled after 7 hours of secret talks. And have you ever heard a diplomat sound more gloomy?
As someone who's been involved in this, I have not broken out the cigars and champagne quite yet, believe me.
The location is the giveaway. This is Beijing, and it alone can force the two sides to talk. China's border with North Korea. The Chinese don't want the collapse of